And we start now with a basement briefing just finished and a chorus of senators from both sides of the aisle now crying foul. And I want to talk about a smoking saw instead of a smoking gun in the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. These are some comments coming after a confidential briefing with CIA Director Gina Haspel. Just listen to Senators Lindsey Graham and Bob Corker.
Open source reports show that he had been focusing on Mr. Khashoggi for a very long time. It is zero chance, zero, that this happened in such an organized fashion without the Crown Prince. As to Pompeo and Mattis, I have great respect for them. I would imagine if they were Democratic, in a Democratic administration, I would be all over them for being in the pocket of Saudi Arabia. But since I have such respect for them, I'm going to assume that they're being good soldiers, and when they look at the analysis, they're being technical in their statement, but they're not giving the assessment that I think the Senate will have. I would really question somebody's judgment if they couldn't figure this out. It is there to be figured out. Please let me finish. And I think the reason they don't draw the conclusion that he's complicit is because the administration doesn't want to go down that road, not because there's not evidence to suggest he's complicit.
Are you said you would be working on a statement over the next between now and
I'm going to do two things.
Anything?
I'm going to do two things. Yes, I'm going to try to get a sense of the Senate resolution where we all vote and designate MBS as one of the people responsible for the death of Mr. Khashoggi, that he was complicit in the murder, that I not only have high confidence, overwhelming belief that that's the case. Then what do you do about it? I want to make sure that Saudi Arabia is put on notice, that business as usual has come to an end for me. I will not look at the kingdom the same way that I used to look at it. I will not support arms sales until all responsible for the death of Mr. Khashoggi have been brought to justice. I will no longer support the war in Yemen as constructed.
Extraordinary comments coming from Senator Lindsey Graham. He also said, quote, "There's not a smoking gun, there's a smoking saw." I want to go now to Capitol Hill. We have CNN senior congressional correspondent Manu Raju there on the Hill for us. Tell us what's going on, Manu.
Yeah, about roughly a dozen senators just emerged from this closed-door briefing. It lasted roughly an hour or so, a little bit over an hour. And we've been hearing almost a unanimous conclusion from Republicans and Democrats alike who have emerged from this briefing saying it is crystal clear to them that the Saudi Crown Prince was behind the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And they're saying that there was very clear evidence, despite the administration, the president himself, downplaying the Crown Prince's role. And you just heard a close ally like Lindsey Graham saying he wants to come down like a, quote, ton of bricks on Saudi Arabia. This is someone who has been close with the Saudi kingdom for some time, but he and other Republicans and Democrats are now trying to coalesce around a legislative response to what happened with Saudi Arabia. Now, we just spoke with Senator Bob Corker, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, who is also part of this effort to try to target Saudi Arabia. And he made it clear that, based on what he saw, that the Crown Prince is guilty of murder.
That, there's no direct evidence of this. And how do you square the two briefings?
Let me just put it this way. If the Crown Prince went in front of a jury, he would be convicted in 30 minutes.
Of murder?
Yes.
Why isn't the Yemen resolution something that does have teeth, one of the right ways to try to punish Saudi Arabia?
Which one?
The Yemen resolution.
Well, the Yemen resolution gets into a war powers situation, and the administration can easily turn right back around and say we're not involved in hostilities.
So there's still some debate about exactly how to respond to what they saw here, Saudi's involvement in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and whether or not to get behind an effort on Capitol Hill to prevent withdraw U.S. involvement from that Saudi-led war in Yemen. So there is a division about exactly how to respond, but there are an overwhelming amount of senators who do want to respond, including the Senate Appropriations Chairman, the Republican Richard Shelby, who just told me that somebody should be punished for this. So the question, Brianna, is what can the Congress do? Can they get behind something before the end of this year? Can they get enough support? And will they have to overcome a presidential veto given the president's resistance to punishing Saudi Arabia? Brianna?
Yeah, he said maybe they did, maybe they didn't. And it didn't seem like he cared in a statement of support for Saudi Arabia. Manu Raju on the Hill. Thank you for that. With me now to discuss these brand new developments is CNN's chief political correspondent, Dana Bash. And I want to answer the question that Manu just posed. Well, what can Congress do? But first, let's just discuss some of the stunning things that we heard from Senators Graham and Corker. Yeah. He said there's no way that this was done without the Crown Prince's knowledge. And he was careful to say open source reports because he just came out of a classified briefing. Right. He wants to be clear that all of the things that we know, just as the public that are out there and being reported, that there's, it's clear that MBS was focusing on Khashoggi for some time.
Yeah, I mean, there was no daylight at all between, and left no question about how they felt. And what Manu said, and it's really important to note, these are Democrats, these are Republicans, these are friends of the administration, these are foes of the administration, crossing over both parties. These are people who are representatives of their states, United States senators, who came out of a briefing appalled by what they saw. And so they wanted to make clear, I think, in the language that you're talking about, not just to the American people, not just to the Saudis, but the guy in the White House, that he better be ready because they are using this language in order to telegraph they're going to act. Question is how they're going to act, but they feel the need to act on a bipartisan basis.
And the reports that are out there, some of them, one key report exclusive to CNN that came out yesterday from our colleague Nina DeSantos, says the motive was essentially that Khashoggi was discussing with another exile of mobilizing this untraceable army online of young Saudis who would take aim at the Saudi government, at the Crown Prince. You can see why he would have this animus for Jamal Khashoggi. When you heard Senator Graham say about Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mattis, who members of Congress, who senators initially got the briefing from, if they were Democrats, I would say they were in the pocket of Saudi Arabia. That's what he said. But essentially because they're Republicans, because I respect them, because I know them, he said, I'll assume they're being good soldiers. But he said they were technical in their statement. He also said that there's no way to conclude because of the intelligence that MBS was not involved. It must be because the administration doesn't want to acknowledge this.
Yeah, I mean, remember, who's saying that? Lindsey Graham, who, you know, many moons ago was a big opponent of President Trump, but in recent months, and even more than that, has been very close with him, even a confidant of President Trump's on issues, both domestic and on national security. And the fact that he's making these kinds of statements on Saudi Arabia, it's noteworthy for a couple of reasons. Number one, Lindsey Graham has been a supporter of Saudi Arabia. So this isn't like he's jumping on a train that he's already been on. So it's a turn for him. And number two, same with someone like Bob Corker. Number two, again, he's trying to telegraph to the administration. What this reminds me of, Brianna, in a much more intense way, is what happened after Russia, after the election with the Russia sanctions. And, you know, unclear.
More intense than that, you think?
I definitely think it's more intense because it's clear cut. Obviously, whatever they heard in this classified briefing, if Bob Corker said, based on what I heard, a jury would convict him in 30 minutes, I mean, that's a pretty intense statement and a very telling statement for someone like that to say. But what it reminds me of is that if these members of Congress decide to go down the sanctions route or, you know, arms sales or, you know, pick your legislative or your policy punishment, it's so unanimous in the anger and the outrage at the Saudi Crown Prince personally and particularly that unless something happens in Saudi Arabia, unless the president does something to act without Congress, Congress is going to try to force his hand, just like they did with sanctions against Russia when it was a huge bipartisan vote, 90-something to almost zero in the United States Senate. Similarly, in the House, they passed it and the president was forced to put some sanctions on Russia.
This is an issue where, yes, it's a complicated issue, but when the president said we may never know the truth on this, on an issue where actually we can ascertain the facts, and not only that, there's bipartisan agreement in Congress that the administration needed to take some action on this. I think that's where you see Congress, like on forcing the president's hand on Russia sanctions, very likely to act to constrain the administration's actions. And I think where the frustration is not that the administration didn't cut off ties with Saudi Arabia or impose sanctions, but simply a refusal to acknowledge the facts here and use our leverage with Saudi Arabia, which is a close ally, to force the king to broaden the base of power there.